In every story about a man being taken, there is a woman at the center. But sometimes the woman at the center is not the woman you think. Sometimes she is standing one house away, older and quieter, with her hands folded and her prayers spoken, and her plans already made before the man ever arrived. Arthur Loxley married May Alonzo in Bacolod on a Saturday in March. He thought he was gaining a wife. He didn't know he was stepping into a structure that had been built for him before he existed, by a woman who wept at his wedding and called him the answer to her prayers. She was right about that. He was exactly the answer she had been praying for, just not in the way he understood. The moment I am going to start with is not the wedding. It's a Tuesday afternoon about 14 months into the marriage, and I am standing at the side of our house in Bacolod in the heat of a February afternoon, behind the bougainvillea that grows against the wall there, and I am listening to my wife on the terrace. She doesn't know I am there. I had come around from the street rather than through the house, the way you sometimes do when you've been out walking and the side gate is closer, and I had stopped because I heard her voice, and then I heard another voice, and then I understood what I was hearing, and I stood still. The other voice was her mother Vicky's. They were talking in Ilonggo, which is the regional language of Bacolod, and which I had been secretly studying for 4 months using an online course and a printed grammar guide I kept in my workshop bag, because I hadn't told May I was learning it, and hadn't entirely decided why I was keeping it from her, except that some instinct I couldn't name had told me to. What they were saying, as best as I could follow with 4 months of self-taught Ilonggo, was this. May was being told what to say to me, and when to say it, and how to frame it, and what to do if I asked certain questions. The subject was the trucking franchise her brother Efren had apparently identified as an opportunity. May was repeating phrases back to Vicky, testing them, and Vicky was correcting her delivery and sharpening her reasoning. They were rehearsing the conversation May was going to have with me that evening. I stood behind the bougainvillea for about 10 minutes. Then I walked quietly back to the gate and came in through the front in the normal way. May made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. She came in from the terrace and she said, as if she'd just thought of it, "Oh, Efren mentioned something interesting about a trucking franchise. Can I tell you about it over dinner?" I said, "Of course." I want to tell you what it felt like to sit at that kitchen table and look at my wife and know what I knew. It felt like looking at a person through glass. Everything on the surface was the same. Her face, her voice, the way she tilted her head when she was about to say something she wanted me to receive well. All of it the same. And underneath it, what I now knew, that this moment had been choreographed 2 hours ago on the terrace, and the person who had written the choreography was not May. Let me go back to the beginning. I owe the beginning its full space, because the beginning explains how I got to that kitchen table. I spent 31 years with South Wales Fire and Rescue. Started at 22 as a firefighter at the Cardiff Central Station. Worked up to watch manager. Finished at 53 on a medical advisory, due to a knee that had been operated on twice, and that my consultant said was going to require a third operation if I kept climbing ladders. I took the medical retirement with the full pension entitlement, which was reasonable, sold my Cardiff semi that I'd owned outright since 2009, and found myself at 53 with time and money and a life that had been organized around the demands of shift work for 31 years, and that now had no shifts. My marriage to Sandra had ended in 2014, the year before I retired. We had been together for 18 years and had 2 boys, Owen, who was 26 and worked in Bristol, and Gareth, who was 23 and still in Cardiff near his mother. The divorce was not hostile, but it wasn't friendly either, which is perhaps the worst kind. The kind that leaves you in a permanent awkward middle, with shared connections and no clear story to tell about what happened. What happened was that the shifts had taken more than I'd given back, and Sandra had made a life that worked without the parts I was absent for, and by the time I was home consistently enough to notice, the parts I was absent for were most of what mattered. I spent 2 years in Cardiff after retirement, doing what a man does when the structure is gone and he hasn't found the replacement yet. I did some consultancy work with a fire safety firm that paid enough to feel productive, but not enough to feel purposeful. I saw Owen when he came back to Cardiff, and Gareth regularly, which was good. I went to the gym, which helped the knee, and gave me somewhere to be in the mornings. I was not unhappy. I was the particular kind of neutral that a man reaches when he has dealt with the worst of his losses and hasn't yet found what replaces them. A colleague from my watch, Pete Devereaux, had retired 2 years before me and gone to the Philippines. He was in Cebu. He sent me photographs occasionally of himself looking relaxed in situations that Cardiff in January could not produce, and he told me on the phone once that the cost of a comfortable life there was considerably less than the cost of a less comfortable one in Cardiff, and that he found the people warm in a genuine way rather than a performed way, and that if I ever wanted to come and look, he had a spare room. I went in the spring after my 2nd year of retirement, spent 2 weeks with Pete in Cebu, and then went south on my own to Bacolod, because Pete had a friend there who ran a small guest house and had recommended it. Bacolod was the right place for reasons I can't fully articulate even now. Something about the pace of it, the scale of it, the fact that it was a city with enough substance to sustain daily life without being large enough to feel anonymous. I liked the food, which is famous throughout the Philippines and which proved that reputation justified. I liked that people seemed to be somewhere rather than passing through somewhere. I stayed 3 weeks instead of 1 and went home thinking I might come back. I met May on the 2nd trip. I had returned in September, 9 months after the first visit, and I was staying at the same guest house and had begun to think seriously about whether a longer stay made sense. The guest house was run by a woman named Mrs. Tsai, who was 60-something, and who knew everyone in her neighborhood the way long-established guest house operators know everyone, as a resource, as a network, as a social institution unto herself. She introduced me to May on the 3rd day, because May was her neighbor's daughter, and was, Mrs. Tsai said, a person of good character, who spoke excellent English, and might be able to help me navigate the city's practical requirements for a longer stay. May was 28. She worked as a receptionist at one of the downtown hotels, and she had the quality of composure that I associated with professional hospitality, warm without being excessive, helpful without being servile. She answered my questions about visas and bank accounts and health care with a directness that I found refreshing after 2 trips of navigating bureaucratic complexity in a language I didn't have. She knew her way around the systems, and she explained them clearly, and she did not try to make the explanation longer than it needed to be, which I respected. We had coffee after the practical session, then dinner 2 days later. Then she showed me the city properly over the following 2 weekends. The places that weren't in the guidebook, the food that was specific to Bacolod, and that she ate with the ease of someone who had grown up with it and still appreciated it rather than taking it for granted. She told me about her family, her mother Vicky, who was 58 and who had raised May and her brother Efren largely on her own after her husband had passed when May was 12. She told me about Efren, who was 26 and drove trucks for a local logistics company. She told me about her childhood in a barangay south of the city, with the candor of someone who had been through genuine hardship and had integrated it rather than being defined by it. I found her very easy to be around. That's the most accurate description I can offer. Not exciting in a performed way, not overwhelming with attention. Easy. Like a person who was simply themselves without effort, and whose self happened to be good company. Her mother, I met on my 4th visit to Bacolod, about 7 months into knowing May. Vicky was small, precise in her movements, and had the quality of total stillness that some people have when they are paying complete attention. She welcomed me into her house, the family home, 1 street from the guest house, a concrete house that was clean and well-maintained in the way of a home that has been cared for over decades with limited means, and she made me feel immediately that I was known and wanted, not performed warmth, something more calibrated than that. She asked about my sons by name, which meant May had told her enough that she had memorized the names, and she asked about Wales and about the fire service with enough specific curiosity to indicate she had done some thinking before I arrived. I found her impressive. That is the honest word. She was a woman who had raised 2 children alone from the age of 46, who had maintained a home, and a standard of family life without the support she should have had, and who had produced a daughter who was by any measure a capable and decent person. I respected that. I also liked her, which is a separate thing from respecting, and is in some ways more important and more dangerous. She took my hands at one point during that first visit and said, "I have prayed for someone like you to come into May's life, someone steady, someone who has worked hard and knows what it is to be responsible." She had tears in her eyes when she said it. I was moved. I remember thinking that this was the kind of matriarchal warmth that people described about Filipino families, and that I had been prepared for, but had not expected to feel so directly. I understand now what I was feeling. I was feeling the effect of a very good opening statement. May and I married in March of the following year, 18 months after we met. I was 64, and she was 30, and the age difference was the subject of one conversation with Owen in Bristol, who asked the questions a son should ask, and was satisfied by the answers I gave, which were honest, and which I believed at the time. Gareth asked no questions, because Gareth had by that point built a relationship with me that operated on a principle of respecting my choices as long as I was clearly thinking about them, and he trusted that I was. The wedding was at a function room near the city center. Vicky had helped organize it, which at the time I found kind, and which in retrospect I understand as her preferred posture in all significant operations. At the center of the organization, holding the information, directing the outcomes. She wept during the ceremony, which was genuine, I believe. The thing is that a person can weep genuinely at a wedding they have also engineered. Those two things are not incompatible. We lived in a rented house initially, while I looked at the options for something more permanent. The rented house was comfortable, and its principal virtue, I thought at the time, was that it was close to Vicky's house, which made things easy for May, who visited her mother most evenings. I thought that was a family dynamic I was lucky to have married into. A close, functional mother-daughter relationship that reflected well on both of them. I have since revised that assessment. The land came first. 6 weeks into the marriage, May brought it to me over dinner, with the careful framing of someone who has thought about how to introduce a subject. She said there was a plot of land near her mother's house that was available, that the owner was selling because he had moved to Manila, that it was a good price for the location, and that it might be worth looking at as somewhere to build eventually. She said this in a way that was curious rather than urgent, exploratory rather than pressuring, and I said I'd like to look. We looked the following Saturday. The plot was perhaps 200 square meters, situated between Vicky's house and the corner of the street, and I noticed as we walked it that Vicky was there when we arrived and had apparently already walked the boundaries and knew exactly where each corner was. She said something in Ilonggo to May, which May translated as, "Mother says the orientation is good for building." I nodded and thought that was a mother's practical observation. I bought the land. The price was £8,000, which the agent confirmed was consistent with the market for that area, and I paid it without extended negotiation. Mai thanked me with a warmth that felt genuine, and that evening Vicky cooked for us, and the dinner had the quality of a celebration that had been anticipated, rather than spontaneous. 8 months later, the conversation about building began. May had been doing research, she said, about house designs that would work on the plot. She had sketches, actual sketches, drawn up by someone who knew what they were doing, with room layouts and a floor plan, and a note about materials. She presented these as the result of her own thinking, and I accepted that at the time, and have since reconsidered whether the sketches originated with May, or with someone else who had had a long time to think about what the land 2 houses from their own home might become. The design had 3 bedrooms. I mentioned to May that we were 2 people and that 3 bedrooms seemed generous. She said that having space for her sons when they visited would be wonderful. She meant Owen and Gareth, who had not expressed any imminent intention to visit the Philippines, but who might, eventually. She also said, and this is the sentence I have replayed most often, "And Mother is getting older. It would be good to have a room for her for when she visits." I said, "Of course." The house cost £64,000 to build. That was a combination of materials, labor, the contractor's fee, and various ancillary costs that arrived throughout the build, in ways that I paid without detailed interrogation, because by the time I had been in Bacolod for 2 years, I had absorbed enough of the household dynamic to understand that questioning individual costs was going to produce a response from May that involved her mother's opinion on the matter. And getting her mother's opinion on the matter meant a visit in which Vicky would explain, with her precise and patient manner, why the cost was necessary. I want to be careful here to describe what Vicky was, rather than what she appeared to be, because the gap between those two things is the story. What she appeared to be, a loving mother, a practical woman, a widow of modest means, who was glad her daughter had married well, and who wanted to help ensure the household was managed sensibly. What she was, the person managing the household. Not in any way I could point to directly, not through any explicit authority or visible control. Through May, who had been managed by Vicky since childhood, and who, I came to understand, had never fully developed the capacity to make a major decision without receiving the architecture of it from her mother first. The trucking franchise was the moment I understood. I have described the terrace, the bougainvillea, the rehearsal through the window, but I want to describe what came after, which is the dinner itself, because what happened at dinner was also instructive. May came in from the terrace. She made tea. We had dinner, which she had cooked. A dish I liked, which I note not to be sentimental, but because food is how care is expressed in this household, and the dish was a deliberate choice. Over dinner, she introduced the trucking franchise, with the phrasing I had heard rehearsed 2 hours earlier, almost word for word. She said Efren had identified a franchise opportunity with a logistics company that operated between Bacolod and Manila. She said the franchise required capital, but generated reliable returns because the company had established contracts. She said she knew it was a lot to ask, but Efren had worked so hard, and this was a real opportunity to change his life. I said, "How much?" She said, £38,000. I said, "Let me think about it." She said, "Of course." She did not push. That was part of the instruction, I believe. Don't push. Let him think. He'll come to it. And the thing is, the not pushing worked. Because a person who doesn't push seems like a person who isn't pressuring you, and a person who isn't pressuring you seems trustworthy. And trust was the whole architecture of everything I was living inside. I didn't transfer the £38,000 immediately. I took 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks I had a conversation with Pete Devereaux in Cebu, who asked good questions about the franchise structure and the company, and the contract verification, and whose questions made me go back to May with specific requests for documentation. She produced them: prospectus, company registration, contract summaries. I looked at them. I am a retired firefighter, not a businessman, but I know how to assess whether a document looks real, and these looked real. What I could not assess, and what I did not know to assess, was whether the business opportunity was as sound as the documentation suggested, or whether the documentation had been selected and presented to show me exactly what was needed to produce a yes. I did not know to assess this, because the person presenting the documentation was my wife, and my wife's honesty was the foundation of the life I was living, and the foundation had not yet shown me any crack I could not explain away. I transferred £38,000 to the franchise account. Efren shook my hand the following weekend with what appeared to be genuine gratitude, and Vicky cooked another dinner that had the quality of a celebration that had been anticipated rather than spontaneous. And I sat at the table and felt, briefly, like a man whose generosity was making real things happen in real people's lives. The franchise never generated the returns the prospectus described. Efren managed it for 8 months before reporting that the parent company had restructured its contract terms in ways that made the margins insufficient. He ran it for another 6 months at a loss before it was wound down. £38,000, effectively gone. I did not connect this outcome to the overheard rehearsal. That is the most important thing I want to say about that period. I knew what I had heard behind the bougainvillea. I had not acted on it, and I had not confronted May about it. Partly because confronting her would have required admitting I had been learning Ilonggo in secret, and partly because I had not yet assembled what I heard into its full meaning. I had heard a coaching session. I had not yet understood that the coaching session was evidence of a system rather than an isolated occurrence. The assembling happened gradually over the following 8 months. I continued the Ilonggo study. I listened more carefully to conversations I had previously been outside of. I began to notice the specific rhythm of how decisions arrived in our household. Proposal from May, gentle but persistent repetition, resolution through payment, followed by a dinner at Vicky's, or by Vicky coming to ours with food. Each decision had that shape. Each one arrived through May and originated one house away. The extension was the one that broke the surface. We had been living in the built house for about a year, when May said that the house was lovely, but the second bedroom was small, and she had been thinking about whether an extension might make it more comfortable. She described a design. The design, I noticed, had a bedroom at the end that was larger than the others, with its own bathroom and a separate entrance from the side of the house. It was, in layout, the design of a self-contained suite for a person who would be living in the house permanently rather than visiting occasionally. I said, "Who would use that room, May?" She said, "We could use it for guests." Or, she paused, "Mother is alone in her house. She's getting older. It might be good for her to be closer." I said, "You're talking about moving your mother in." She said, "Not permanently, just for convenience. She's so close already." I said, "Modi, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." She looked at me with an expression I had seen before, but had not previously read correctly. It was the expression of a person who is waiting to find out which question is coming, so they can determine which prepared answer to use. I said, "How much of this have you decided yourself? The land, the house, the extension, the franchise? How many of these started with you, and how many started with your mother?" She was quiet for a long moment. The quiet was different from her usual quietness. It had a texture of something being processed that was more complicated than she could quickly resolve. She said, "My mother gives me advice." I said, "I heard you on the terrace, with the franchise, before you came in to talk to me about it." Another silence. I said, "You were going through what to say, with your mother. She was telling you how to present it." She said, "She was helping me." I said, "She was coaching you." She said, "It's the same thing in my family." I said, "It isn't the same thing for me." We sat with that for a while. The house was quiet around us. The house I had paid £64,000 to build, on land I had paid £8,000 for, with an extension that Vicky had designed and that was intended to bring Vicky into the house in a permanent arrangement that had been part of the plan, I now understood, for considerably longer than I had been part of May's life. May said, "My mother wants the best for our family." I said, "Your family or our family?" She didn't answer that. I said, "May, I'm going to ask you something that I think is the most important question. I want you to take time with it before you answer. Do you want to be married to me? Not what your mother wants, what you want." She looked at me for a long time. Her face did something I had not seen it do before, which was change in a way that suggested the layer underneath the composed surface was not as composed as the surface. She looked, for a moment, genuinely uncertain. Not performing uncertainty, actually uncertain. She said, "I don't know how to answer that separately." That sentence has stayed with me. I don't know how to answer that separately. It was the most honest thing she said to me in 3 years of marriage, and it was devastating in a way that her collaboration in everything that had preceded it was not, because everything that had preceded it had at least the structure of intention. This was something else. This was a woman telling me, as clearly as she could, that she had never been given the equipment to want something independently of her mother's wanting, and that this was not a recent condition, but a lifelong one, and that she wasn't sure she had a self that existed outside of that architecture. I calculated the total when I got back to Cardiff. I did not go back to Cardiff immediately. There were things to arrange, and I am not a man who makes impulsive decisions when methodical ones are available. But I went back 4 months after the terrace conversation, after a series of additional conversations with May and one conversation with Vicky that I will describe briefly because it deserves brief description. I sat with Vicky in her front room, and I told her what I knew and what I had worked out. I told her about the overheard rehearsal. I told her about the extension design and what I understood it to mean. I told her that I was not angry at her in the way one is angry at someone who has done something unexpected, because none of what she had done was, in the context of her own framework, wrong. She had protected her family. She had identified a resource and organized her family to access it. I had been the resource. Vicky said, "I love my daughter." I said, "I know you do." She said, "I wanted her to be safe." I said, "I understand that." She said, "Is this the end?" I said, "I think it has to be." She said, "I'm sorry, Arthur." I believed the apology was real. I also believed that if the same set of circumstances arose again, with the same options available to her, she would make the same choices, because the choices came from love and from necessity and from a mother's determination to protect her child in the only way she knew how. I did not tell her this because it was not useful to say, but I thought it clearly, and I have continued to think it. The total was £150,000. Land, house build, franchise, various smaller transfers throughout the marriage for costs that had arrived one by one, and that I had not been tracking as a cumulative figure, because I had been inside a relationship rather than auditing one. The forensic accountant Owen, engaged from Bristol, was thorough and unemotional about it, and when he read me the figure I sat in Owen's spare bedroom in Bristol and looked at the ceiling and said, "Right." Owen said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I said, "It's not what I expected at 66. He said, "No." I said, "I'm all right." He said, "I know you are. You always are." There is something Owen has always understood about me that I have not always understood about myself, which is that the managing is both a strength and a way of not feeling things fully. He didn't say this directly that evening. He said it in the way he has of saying things he means without saying them explicitly, which I find both frustrating and one of the qualities I value most in him. Gareth rang the following week. He asked how I was, and I told him honestly, and he was quiet, in the way Gareth is quiet when he is deciding whether to offer an opinion or just receive what he's been told. And he chose the reception rather than the opinion, which was the right choice. He said, "Come over when you're ready. I've got a garden that needs sorting, and you're better at it than me." I said I would come in May. I am in Cardiff now. The Cardiff flat I rented while deciding what to do next is small and adequate, and has the particular quality of a space that is entirely mine, which I have found in the months since returning to be a quality I have undervalued. Every object in it is there because I put it there. Every arrangement is the result of my preference. Nobody is being coached in the next room on how to present me with something I didn't know I was going to be presented with. I think about May more than I think about Vicky, because Vicky is legible to me in a way that May is not. Vicky wanted what she wanted, and she organized the means of getting it with a thoroughness that I can evaluate even if I can't admire. May is harder. May is the person who sat across from me and said I don't know how to answer that separately, and who was telling the truth, and whose truth makes the anger I feel toward her complicated in ways I haven't fully worked through. Some days I'm furious at her. Not the controlled professional anger that I could manage in 31 years of emergency situations. Real anger, the kind that arrives at 3 in the morning and isn't interested in nuance or context or the mitigating circumstances of a daughter raised her whole life to be someone's instrument. Just anger at the loss, at the years, at the £150,000 that is gone and not coming back, at the fact that I sat at a dinner table and listened to my wife deliver a rehearsed pitch, and accepted it because the alternative was admitting what I'd heard, and what I'd heard meant the entire edifice was constructed rather than grown. Most days I pity her, not in a superior way, or I try not to let it be that. In the way you pity a person who has been so thoroughly shaped by someone else's will that they don't know what their own looks like. May is 31 years old, and she has never made a major decision without her mother's architecture underpinning it. And the worst part of that is that she may not know what it feels like to make one. She has never had the practice. Vicky blessed my marriage. She wept real tears. She called me the answer to her prayers, and she was right. because I was exactly what she had been arranging for. A steady man with a pension and a good will, who didn't ask difficult questions, and who would build the house 2 streets from her own, and fund the family's advancement without ever stepping back far enough to see the shape of the arrangement he was inside. She blessed me with one hand and invoiced me with the other, and the blessing was real, even as the invoice was running, and I am still working out what to do with a situation in which both of those things are true simultaneously. I am 66 years old, and I was a firefighter for 31 years, and I have walked into buildings that were on fire, and I have pulled people out of things they could not get out of themselves, and I know what it is to do something frightening, and to do it anyway, because it needs doing. That capacity did not help me in Bacolod. In Bacolod, the danger was not visible, and did not have smoke or heat or a clear physical form, and I do not have 31 years of training for the kind of fire that presents as a blessing and burns slowly and leaves you standing in Cardiff at 66, looking at the ceiling of your son's spare bedroom, saying, "Right, I am sorting Gareth's garden in May. I am meeting Pete Devereaux in Cebu in September, a week, just to see, not to rebuild anything, just to see whether the country that contains Bacolod and Vicky and May and 150,000 pounds of my pension also contains enough of what I went there for originally to warrant another look." Pete says it does. He says come, and we'll sit somewhere and eat something, and you can decide from there. I think I'll take him up on that. Some things are worth finding out slowly, and some things, once found, are worth going back to, in the right way, with the right eyes, asking the right questions, at every step. I know how to do that now. It only cost me everything I had to learn,